Well, now a little bit about the topic of our next panel. It was born out of a piece of thought leadership that Governance Institute has completed in partnership with Diligent and LexisNexis, both of whom are long-standing partners of Governance Institute on so many projects and events. A copy of the thought leadership paper is on all delegate seats, and you can also find out plenty more at the Diligent and LexisNexis exhibition stands. Also, this plenary will be turned into a podcast, so watch out for it in the 18th of September news update email, which Governance Institute will be sending out. This means our facilitator should be repeating your questions after you've asked them so that everything is perfectly crystal clear on the recording. And now to introduce our final panel, please welcome the host of Inside America's Boardrooms, TK Kerstetter.
So welcome everyone. First of all, before she gets too far, since this is the last formal event, I want us to take a moment and thank Angeline for being such a great host over these 2 days. So audience, let's thank this wonderful host and the good job that she's done. Yes, you're welcome. And as she said, this is the future of the governance professional. And I've got two very capable people that are joining me on stage. The first needs no introduction, but please welcome Megan Motto, who's the Chief Executive with the Governance Institute of Australia. Megan, and right behind her is Julie McPherson, who's the Company Secretary and Group General Counsel for Amcor. Welcome, Julie. You guys want to grab a seat? And as been said, this is going to look into the future. We're going to use some research to really get our arms around sort of what should we be thinking about, how does this disrupt the company secretary. And as I'm sitting down here, I do want to say that I am from the States and from outside of Atlanta, Georgia. And my trip here has been just wonderful. This city and this country is just amazing. But I did have one small sad point. The Australian national basketball team defeated the USA and broke their 78-game winning streak. And while I'm sad, I'd just like to say, way to go, Aussie boys. So, Megan, I think a good place to start is for you to maybe give us a little brief foundation again for the GIA and just why this group is here and why it's important.
Fantastic, and so most people in the audience will have a good grasp of the GIA because I'm sure that there's many members in the room. But fundamentally, as a professional association for governance professionals, we really exist to do two things, and that is to lift the professionalism of the professionals who are our members and our subscribers and the people that come to all of our courses. So it's to lift the standards of the professions, but it's also to lift the status of governance and of the need for good governance. So it's really important that we balance those two things appropriately, that we're raising the issues with regulators, with governments, with right across all three sectors, the not-for-profit sector, the public sector, the private sector, lifting the status of why governance is important, why we need those rules in place, and in the same breath, we must maintain the professionalism.
So while you're on a roll, okay, this is all about the research. The core of this, the foundation of this is about the research that was done about the future of the governance professional. So talk a little bit about what the factors were to do this and then what you ended up finding as key results.
Fantastic, thank you. So we know that the world of the governance professional is changing rapidly, as everything else is changing rapidly. And we know very much that the way that we performed as a profession in the past is not the way we're performing today, and it will not be the way that we perform in the future. And so we wanted to do a piece of research that really did a deep dive and a bit of a long-term look into what our predictions were for the future state for the governance professional. So we're very lucky to partner with LexisNexis and Diligent to do this work, and we did a really comprehensive study starting in May this year, We initially interviewed 10 senior governance professionals to get some insight, and then we did an online survey where we had 285 respondents, 60% of which were members of the Governance Institute, but 40% who came from broader afield. And then we brought it back to another discussion session of very senior governance professionals who were really looking at those boards that are very sophisticated at the cutting edge of where we think the rest of the profession might be going. So it was a great report to put together, and it really demonstrated a couple of really key things. And if you don't mind, I might just go through a couple of the conclusions that came out of the report. So there were three key themes in terms of the way that the profession will change. And look, these won't come as an enormous surprise, but I think the veracity and the pace is what's going to be the real surprise. So the first theme is that there is more complexity than ever before. And when we surveyed our cohort, 80% of our cohort said that complexity was going to be one of the number one key issues that they were going to really have to grapple with. We talked about cognitive overload in one of the earlier sessions, and I think that's very true. There is so much external factors, so many internal factors, external factors to be considering when you're doing your job, and that's before you even start managing the personalities and dealing with the emotional intelligence that you need to be great at your job. So the complexity of dealing with regulators, funders, members, staff, customers, activists, media, I mean the list just goes on, the number of factors that come into play when we're doing our jobs. And of course, the really thorny one there is these issues of culture and ethics, because they are less easily defined in some ways, they are more amorphous, they're more difficult to grapple with, and that's why we're having lots of conversations about them, and that's why the Royal Commission came to the conclusions that it did. The second big theme coming out of the report was the pace, the style, and the adherence to regulatory change and the attitude of regulators and the way that that will change. And Anna was quite right. After a Royal Commission, you tend to have an oscillation where the pendulum swings heavily in the favour of more compliance, more regulation, and it oscillates over time, and that's just the natural state of things. It's like working in a federal government system. You have centralisation and then decentralisation and then centralisation and then decentralisation over the years. So that is very much a natural state of flow, but overarchingly, we think that the governance professional is going to have to deal with more regulation, and I'd say not just formal regulation, but quasi-regulation in the form of being answerable to stakeholder groups, not just formal regulators. So one of the things, once again, that came out of Hayne is that whole question of not just can we do this, but should we do this? And that's going to be forefront in the minds of people when they're thinking about regulation. It might comply with regulation, but how is it going to look, you know, in the next Royal Commission? You know, if I'm on the stand at the next Royal Commission, is this going to be watertight? Am I going to be happy? And the third big trend, of course, was technology. And we've talked a lot about technology, but the advent of technology in the boardroom, what it will mean, not just for the way that we compile data, the style of data that we compile, but the speed with which decisions are made. And that concept where, I reflect on even 10 years ago, board papers were all written and hard mailed. They were all in paper. They got mailed out in hard copy. So there was probably a lag time of maybe 2 months between the report being written and when the information was current and the directors reading it and making decisions on it in the boardroom. Now we can have not only information coming into the boardroom that is current as of that day, but predictive analytics gives us information about what might be reasonably foreseeable into the future. And when boards are going to be asked, what would you have reasonably ought to have known to make that decision? If you're not looking at predictive analytics to give you some clues to what you ought to have known reasonably, then I think you'll be falling behind. Just really quickly, what does that mean for the governance professional and the way the actual role will change? Well, there's a couple of key things there. Definitely the role will change from being more of a secretarial role to that trusted advisor. Boards will lean a lot more on their company secretary. They will be having a lot more in-depth conversations, a lot more to and fro. It won't just be a master-servant relationship. They'll be going from the minute taker to the thought leader. So it won't just be about recording what's happened, but it'll be about bringing information to assist that thought leadership work. It'll be much less being about the servant of the board, as I said, and being much more around being the conscience of the board, the moral compass of the board at times, and making sure that the board are thinking not just about the compliancy with regulation, as I said, but the reputational risks and some of those non-financial risks. We know that the company secretary will move from being a person who collates and supplies information to someone who is much more in the business of curating information, analysing information, and then using that information to be the trusted advisor to boards. We will not just be about supplying answers, but about actually stimulating the questions, stimulating the wider thinking by proactively raising questions themselves and stimulating that really creative thinking in the boardroom that we were talking about in the last sessions this afternoon. And finally, it will go from being a role that is very process-based to being one that is very principled-based and being, as I said, that moral compass. So that's the key findings coming out of the report that we did.
So, Megan, you and I can look at this, but we're not in the trenches, and that's why we have Julie up here, because you are in the trenches. So when you saw this research and from your own experiences, what was your reaction to the research, and how do you think that the COSEC job has evolved?
Okay. So when I was first asked this question, I joined Amcor about 15 years ago. And the previous company secretary was a lovely gentleman who had a finance background. And two things came to mind when he was doing his handover. The first thing was he wheeled out a huge olive green bag, like a suitcase. And he said, "You're going to need this bag when you go on board visits." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, you've got to carry all the plugs for the directors because half of them leave all their plugs behind." So I declined the offer of the olive green bag. The other thing that he had was he had a little box of yellow cards. And it was only when I was looking at this session that I remembered the little box of yellow cards. It was a bit like, you know, when you do debating at school and you've got these cards and you write handwritten notes. And so this little box of cards had all these little handwritten notes, and they were all of the regulatory, you know, listing requirements and dates. And the secretary would come in with a follow-up, you know, on a particular day and hand you the little yellow card. And it was like, this isn't going to work for me. And so if I fast forward 15 years, you know, the role is now, in my view, a critical role in the governance of the company. It's such an important role, and you're the critical link between the board and management. And if I just go through some of the examples of the way that, you know, my role has evolved since I joined. You know, so setting the agenda, you know, I think previously the agenda was a little bit of a pattern, you know, each sort of board meeting there was certain papers. I think now, you know, once you establish a relationship, and I went around, I met each of the directors individually and the chair and asked them what their issues were, you know, how they perceived the board was working. And then you've got that information, you can have a look at the agenda, you've got access to senior management, to the chief executive. So you have a look at the agenda in a different light. So what is there on the agenda that the board would be interested in? You know, should you have external speakers? You know, there are a lot of things that came up today on innovation, you know, there's sustainability. You know, if you are, you know, if you've got overseas operations, then, you know, what can you do to bring some value to the board and to the discussion? So it's not death by PowerPoint, which is a pretty easy sort of thing to fall into. So that was one example. You know, risk. So again, you know, some companies have risk committees, others just present risk reports. In our case, we're manufacturing, we don't have a risk committee as such, but we do present quite detailed risk reports. We've got a very large risk department that goes around and puts all this information together. But again, from the board perspective, you know, to be proactive with the directors and have a look at the risks. You know, is there something on that report that isn't being addressed? You know, the board have got different perspectives. They're often on you know, they've got different backgrounds, they've got different relationships, so what's there? I mean, even just a simple example is CEO succession. You know, everybody's got usually 9 boxes and, you know, somebody's going to arrive in the top right-hand corner. But the reality is, if something happens to your chief executive, you know, who's going to step in? You know, you know, these are complex, public companies are complex beasts. Who's going to be able to actually take over in a crisis? You know, what you're planning. Have these things been thought about? Is that's what's important to the board. So there's a lot of activity that you can do in the risk area. Another area that you can be very proactive in is composition of the board. So again, when I joined, go back 15 years, it was a pretty homogenous board. All Australians all knew each other, had probably all worked together, lived within a few kilometres of each other. And you know, I recall, because we had a lot of overseas operations, and I said to our chair, you know, perhaps we should use a headhunter. Well, that was a bit radical, but he was open to the idea. And we ended up getting 2 Swiss-based directors. We had a large presence in Europe. We've added, at the moment, you know, there's American directors. We've got a lady from who's based in China, Hong Kong. So, you know, if you have a look at what's the company look like now, what's the future of the company, and what should the board look like? What sort of skill sets do you need? You know, what geographies do you want your directors to be in? You know, maybe it does make sense to be all Australian if it's a purely domestic and there's no potential future to develop overseas, but, you know, maybe it's not. So, you know, you're just so well placed because you see everything. You know, it's an amazing role. I have to say, I'll get that in now and I'll say it at the end, but it's an amazing role. You know, you're right in the heart of everything. You see all of the board discussions, you see all of the issues there, and so, you know, you're really well placed to add value in that particular area. Remuneration is another one. I think, you know, remuneration is obviously, you know, HR, and you've got lots of consultants that help, but the 3 strikes rule in Australia makes it a far more important aspect for directors. Because none of them, you know, I don't think we've ever seen a spill. I don't think even the investors want to actually spill the whole board, but as soon as you get a strike, there's a lot of anxiety. So in the company secretary role, you're out there, you're meeting with the proxy advisors, you're sitting through the HR committee, you're having a look at what the consultants are telling you. So again, you're quite well placed to add value in how the remuneration might be structured, what's you know, what works, what doesn't work, what are the touch points. You know, my experience, the proxy advisors do not like soft targets. You know, they're commenting on your remuneration report. They want to understand what are the financial targets. They want objective targets. They don't like subjective. Yet you've got Royal Commissions coming out who are, you know, talking about, you know, culture and, you know, ethics and all that sort of thing. So how do you put the two together that ensures that, you know, investors still receive a proper return and you're still meeting the, you know, ethical requirements? So it's all of those issues that you can look at. I mean, we had one case where our chair of the audit committee we were told that they would have voted against him because of the proportion of audit to non-audit fees. Still a big issue. They still write articles about it. But again, these are things, at the end of the day, it came down to the explanation as opposed to the actual, you know, numbers. But these are things where, you know, if you are at the, you know, on the front line, then you're in a position to actually, you know, add value to how those things are represented. I suppose the last one that I would touch on would be minutes. Again, Royal Commission, CBA had a somewhat unfortunate time with Mr. Hayne in relation to minutes. And I've always taken the view that, you know, there's a general philosophy that they should be relatively brief, but I've always been very careful where there's an issue that, you know, is potentially going to come under scrutiny. And I certainly a few times in my career, I've had regulators look at aspects of transactions that a company that I've been with has been involved in. We haven't had any issues, but if you, and just as an example, impairment. So if you've got a potential concern over an impairment, you know, management's written a paper and analysis setting out why you don't need to take an impairment. The auditors have all looked at it. But, you know, at the board level, you certainly, you know, there'll be directors that will ask questions. So, for example, they might say, well, you know, why did you choose that discount rate? You know, you've put all the calculations there. And those are the sort of things I think it's really very helpful to make sure you've got a much more detailed reflection of the questions. So why did management choose that discount rate? And then management will respond as to why they thought those assumptions were realistic. And so you've actually got a record, because I think at the end of the day with regulators, as much as anything, if you've actually thought about it and taken a reasonable position based on reasonable assumptions, you tend to come out in a good space. It's where you've just got a couple of lines that, you know, the board endorsed management's paper that it doesn't look so good. So I think it's a judgment call, but it is really a very important part of the role. And so it just pays to look carefully at issues that you consider might at some future come under scrutiny by some sort of external third party.
So I was especially interested in looking at the research and the opening question about what would affect them going forward. I've had some exposure to a study in the UK and the US, but they looked at not just COSECs, there was also directors. They said, what keeps you up at night and going forward in the future? No surprise, the number one thing that I was curious of whether this would translate into Australia as well, but the number one reason was global political risk, okay? No big surprise, Trump, Chinese trade wars, Iran situation, all of that creates political unrest. And in the UK, we've got Brexit. So I guess it's not surprising that that would be number one. Interestingly, number two for that was investors putting pressure on boards around all issues, whether it was purpose, whether it was diversity, where people that traditionally were counted on to vote with management, the BlackRocks and the Vanguards and the State Streets, were now withholding votes. And believe me, if you want to get some unrest in the boardroom and put the COSEC in a position to scramble a little bit, just have the board start to get votes withheld and get the directors hopping around starting to get nervous of whether they're going to be reelected or not. So it's a little different. One of the things in Australia is you still have a lot of boards with staggered boards, where if you have that in the US, you'll get no votes for that. So anyway, I thought the research was interesting. I think it's certainly worth a read. I'd like to take a little difference.
There is a copy on your tables if you'd like to read it and take it home. I would not be doing my job as CEO if I didn't give it a plug.
Yeah. Was I supposed to do that?
I've
Okay.
taken care of it, it's fine.
So I want to switch a little bit because I have an observation about COSECs that I think is worth a discussion. And that is, in my travels, I have found that there is different levels of respect in organizations and how they view the corporate secretary. And in some, and we'll hear from Julie on this, I think that there is great respect. They're included in, if it's not the management team, certainly the issues that happen and the board issues. I happened to be in a situation when I first joined a board where the COSEC was, there was also a general counsel, and then the COSEC was a separate position. The general counsel was the one that attended the board meetings. The COSEC didn't get close, actually, to that, and they handled the COSEC work with the general counsel, who then worked with the board. Well, when I came on the board, the general counsel was always busy. There was no time. They were working on other issues, M&A or whatever it might be. So I developed a relationship with the company secretary. And they were a tremendous resource for me. And I introduced that resource to other board members. Well, over the next 2 years, guess who was invited to the board meetings because of the resource that they were available? But I almost thought that it took my initiative to educate the directors on the value of a good corporate secretary, or what you call company secretary. So I'm curious on both your views, because first of all, I see that all over where I go. I'm not familiar enough with Australian companies to know what happens here. But how do we I mean, it shouldn't have to happen the way it happened for me, but how can we make sure that we're elevating that, that resource and having everybody understand the value of that? So I'm going to save you, Megan. I'm going to start with Julie on this because I don't think this has been your experience.
No, I mean, I do have the joint role. So I have both the Group General Counsel and the Company Secretary role, and that does make it, you know, a little bit easier. But having said that, I think there is certainly a trend to have separate company secretaries to general counsels. But you know, I think the way to elevate it is you've got this wonderful opportunity where you've got direct access to the chair and to each of the directors, and you've got access, you know, to senior management because you are facilitating, you know, the agendas, you're facilitating board meetings, so you're very well placed. But if you just sort of sit back and you know, take a backseat role, you won't get there. But if you're proactive and you look at the opportunities where you can actually add value, and just some of the few examples that I gave you, then I think you will find, as Kay said, that it's a, you know, there's a real opportunity to be heard. But you just have to be a bit proactive and form the relationships and understand what's important to both sides. And then you become the trusted advisor, and you'll have both the chair and the CEO contacting you saying, you know, I want to do this or I want to do that. How's the best way to go about it? And so you get a seat at the table because you recognised as adding value.
So this has to be an issue for you.
Yeah, look, I've seen my experience both as a director of many boards over the years and an observer of many boards, because I used to run an industry association, which of course gave me a window into hundreds of companies in a particular sector. And the lived experience is that there is a massive range, ranging from your experience, which is a really evolved one, but the level of maturity of, I would say, a good proportion of companies in Australia is simply not there. And I'll give you a couple of examples. I mean, it's really interesting to me that if you want to go, if you need surgery, you go to a doctor, and they need to be a licensed surgeon. If you need a crack in your swimming pool looked at, you go to a licensed engineer. And yet, the most fundamental structure that we've got in Australia is the company structure. And when you register a company, you don't have to have a CEO, you don't have to have staff, you don't have to have anything else, but you have to have directors and you have to have a company secretary. And a fair amount of people enter start-up companies and they actually have no idea what either of those roles entails. And that is an absolute travesty, and I think something that certainly in my time at the Governance Institute, I want to raise that as a really fundamental issue. So I've seen companies where the company secretary is a dual role. It's seen simply as, if not just a tick box exercise or a minute taker, then almost a pain in the neck, someone that get around, get through despite someone who's a bit of a handbrake to happiness and is making us comply with all these rules. And that is if you've got a company secretary that even knows what their duties are. Most people will say, oh yes, I'm the company secretary, and that means that, oh, I have to pay that ASIC bill once a year. That's the extent of the understanding. And that, to me, is just absolutely not acceptable. But the reality is that there is a huge range of maturities in organisation. I've been doing a lot of speaking in the aged care sector, given that there is a live Royal Commission in the aged care sector. And similarly, I've had people stand up and say, oh, I understand that as of 1st of July next year that we're, as directors of these aged care centres, going to have this thing called liability. and horrified when I said, well, I hate to be the one to inform you, but forget about the 1st of July next year. You've always had it. And by the way, you've got the same liability as you would if you were on the board of BHP or any other large organisation. And people are horrified. They get themselves onto boards, into company secretary positions, and they don't do adequate training. And that is something we really need to rectify.
So our time is quickly fleeting here, but there's a question that has been submitted and I want to ask that. And Julie, I think this is best for you to answer. It says, beyond all of this, the COSEC has the role to play in bringing investor and shareholder sentiment to the board's ears. I think they're asking, is that a function of the corporate secretary to share with the board the shareholder sentiments and whatever?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, again, you're well placed. You're out there, talking to proxy advisors. You talk to some investors. I think it's vital. I mean, the board rely heavily on the company secretary for their reputation. And so it's very important, if there are issues out there that could negatively impact the board and the company, that those things are aired. And you've got the opportunity to ensure during board meetings that if there are those sorts of issues, that you are facilitating, ensuring that there's an education process as to what those might be, what you might need to do to address them, and ensure that those risks don't reflect negatively on the board and yourself. Because as I used to say to our head of investor relations, all care, no responsibility for that role, all care or responsibility for the company secretary role. You're an officer, so.
So in the US, in the mega corporations, there's typically an investment relations officer, and they spend all day talking to analysts and large shareholders and et cetera. So they will form a team with the corporate secretary and keep the board updated. As you go down in size, though, when somebody doesn't have the means to have, for example, the person is the general counsel, they're also the corporate secretary, and they're also the IRO, then obviously they're doing that. But my experience, again, the US is the IRO is also a very active team member with the corporate secretary team.
Yep.
So we're slowly running out of time, but I'd like you guys, here we are, we got our important COSEC sitting in the audience, waiting to hear these final words of wisdom, okay? So Megan, I'll start with you. Here's our chance for a closing statement and what they should take home with them.
I'm going to make some observations in the wrap-up in a minute, but I just thought I'd take a moment to address, we talked a lot about getting young directors in over the course, and one of the things that actually came out of the report was this concept of younger people participating much more actively in boardrooms directly. And it reminds me very much of the conversation that we had about women in the boardroom that unfortunately we are still having. But the conversation went, well, when women are educated, then they'll make boards. And we've been more educated. We have higher rates of participation in university from women than men now for almost 3 decades, and that's not eventuated. The pipeline has not fixed itself. And then, well, maybe women aren't as ambitious as men, and we've found out through a range of studies that women are absolutely as ambitious as men. But there are absolute structural and unconscious bias reasons for women not participating as fully as they could. And I think the same goes for young people. And what we're finding now with movements like the Male Champions of Change is that you actually have to look at structural redesign, organisational redesign, to get past some of those unconscious biases. So one of the things that I would challenge boards to do is to unpack, it's definitely something where you can assist a young director to be more confident in the boardroom with training, with some side conversations, with some side coaching. But you also have to train the rest of the directors to unpack their own unconscious biases. Because if you hear in the boardroom, oh, I thought that when I was your age too, or oh, you weren't alive when we made that decision, or you weren't born yet, then eventually you shut up. You stop talking because there is an unconscious message there that you do not have the experience and gravitas to participate fully in this conversation. So my encouragement would be that boards have to look at training the rest of the directors as well as any of the young directors or women or any other type of diversity that you're bringing on the board. There's a huge amount of research in this space, and the same, I think, goes for all of those debates.
Julie?
Okay, well, I think that was can't add much more to that on diversity, other than I would say it's also ethnic diversity too.
Absolutely.
So I think, one thing with women, it's good to have ethnic diversity, and we are very homogenised, I think, in this country. Look, I'll be very, very brief. I think, as I said, it's a very rewarding and interesting career from what it was many, many years ago. You see everything. You've got the opportunity to add tremendous value. And to leverage those opportunities. So I'd encourage people who want to pursue this career at the top level that it's very exciting and can lead to all sorts of interesting parts of your career and opportunities to add value to the governance, to the board, to the company.
And so I get the benefit of the last word, and my advice coming out of this is, even with all we've said, it still boils down to what you have to do you're going to be given opportunities, and you have to take advantage of those opportunities. You have to be prepared. You have to be in a situation where you're going to wow them when you have that chance, so that opportunities are created. And sometimes you have to push for that opportunity, and don't be afraid to do that. All they can do is say no. If you're doing good stuff, don't be afraid to do it. So anyway, with that, would you thank my expert panelists here?